Hi everyone, my name is Jasmine Soriano. This is my capstone inquiry project, my digital presentation for the topic of consequences within the classroom. This is the course IDS 3713 with Dr. Montemayor in the spring of 2023 semester. The first topic that I want to go over is the research identity memo. Throughout this paper, I did name my identities to be a Hispanic Catholic woman that is very family oriented. So with my research question, a lot of the questions originated from wanting to know more about behavior in the classroom. It really did focus on behavior, especially from what I knew growing up in the classroom, what behavior was supposed to look like, what was expected of me from my parents, what was expected of me from my teacher. I was very, thrown back when I started my clinical teaching, and it wasn't quite like that anymore, for varied reasons. And my mentor teacher did mention that COVID did have a lot to do with that. So, as far as my research question went, it started to originate with the fact that I knew how my family worked and what was expected of me, like I said, and I wanted to learn more about students' behavior and how to be able to accept that in my classroom and to understand what different behavior looked like and what the consequences should be for each of those. With taking into mind my identity, I wanted to use that to help my research question development. So originally, the question that I wanted to base my inquiry on was how can we know right away as teachers when a child is acting out due to an underlying mental disorder or from just a simple lack of maturity or respect? So there was a very simple and vague answer to that when I began researching it, and I realized that my question needed to be much more complex. After, kind of shifting gears and trying to find something more complex, I kind of left that question go and more so be like a base where I can start a new complex question. So the question that I was able to come up with to then make my paper into was, is it okay to differentiate behavior-related consequences with the students? What cases is this okay, and what type of impact does this have on the students? I found this question to be much more complex. I found lots of resources that had to do with this, and I also included some interviews as well. The purpose of this study kind of originated from two different things. On one hand, I was just in the beginning of my clinical teaching, and I had a student who was dealing with this. I had a student who was eloping, who had a really tough time with non-preferred tasks, and would just completely, like I said, elope, would have a complete breakdown, throw things around the room, and I was very curious as to how my mentor teacher was to right away spot what was going on, know exactly what was wrong with her, or what she thought was wrong with her, or not necessarily wrong, but what was going on. And I was unfortunately not able to do that, but I mean, how could I when she has about 30 years of experience and I was just starting my very first year of clinical teaching? I found that as a perfect opportunity for me to dive in and research some more about this, and that was one purpose of my study, was so that I can help myself in my clinical teaching, which eventually worked near the end, to help and try to figure out my way of understanding that behavior. The second portion was because I wanted to be able to help myself as a first-year teacher as well as other first-year teachers, because I feel like going into first-year teaching, this idea of classroom management or student behavior is going to be the most struggling part, despite all the other things that we have going on. But I feel like the answer to this research question is going to help first year teachers in the long run, especially because I feel like resources for first year teachers aren't necessarily provided in that aspect. I was talking to my mentor teacher about the type of trainings and resources that she had as a first year teacher, and none of them tended to include classroom management. So that was another purpose for having this research question. Now going into the essential literature, these are the interview questions that I had asked both of my participants. The first one was, in your opinion, is there a way to differentiate the difference between negative behavior in the classroom that is rooted in the underlying mental disorder and the difference between negative behavior that stems from simple lack of control? Both of them had a similar answer to this question. They both stated that it did take them around 7 to 10 years to be able to get this under their belt completely. It had to do with a lot of research that they did on their own time, but they both did say that they were able to get this eventually, but most definitely not in their first year. They did share by, it did help them by researching things on their own, finding the specific causes of the student behavior and, understanding why those things were happening. The second question, when implementing differentiated consequences within the classroom, how have you seen it impact the students receiving the consequences as well as those around them? One teacher, I really did appreciate her answer. I found it very helpful. She did go into detail about how having student relationships was very important in trying to maintain classroom management. She did mention a lot of teachers think that when it comes to classroom management, it has to be very cut and dry, very strict, very harsh. But she mentioned that the most effective classroom management that she found for herself was the exact opposite. It was very nurturing, very open, very fun. The students trusted her with her decisions, and she said that when she had differentiated consequences. Let's say, for example, a student had ADHD, and of course, the students don't know all of that personal information. So the teacher would give a different type of consequence to that student because she knows that that student is struggling to pay attention or to stay on task, versus a student who is just acting out to not do their work or to not stay on task. It would be a different consequence. She did mention that communication is very important in that process as well, just making sure the students know that favoritism is not happening, that like nobody is special, that kind of thing, everything is fair. And she just did mention, the overall building of relationships as well as communication helps with that situation of impact on students. I did ask them that third question as well. However, going into my research, I did find that was kind of irrelevant towards what I was trying to find the answer to. So I did omit that. Another piece of literature that I found incredibly helpful during this research study was the journal by Kim and Ha. It was a research study that basically placed a bunch of kids in a classroom and expected them to, process and do everything just like normal students should. They did provide expectations at the beginning of the day. Towards the end of the day, they noticed that everyone was sort of acting out. Everyone was acting the same. For example, they were all distracted, or they were all playing around, or they were all demonstrating the same behavior. However, it was notated after the fact that about 75% of those students did have an underlying mental disorder. The other 25% did not have anything going on. They just were behaving that way because of a lack of respect or lack of maturity for the teacher. So I really appreciated that piece of literature. It just restated what we were saying about the consequences within the classroom having to be differentiated. My second source that I had in this was from the Acker research. It just proved that when there was a classroom that had consequences or reprimands in place on a regular basis, those students tended to progress and achieve more than a classroom who did not have any type of consequences or any type of reprimands. This process was done over a 2-week period. They were placed in that classroom, and one teacher was told not to have any type of consequences in any way, while the other teacher was told to make sure that those were present. During that process, they were able to see that the students did not want to perform when there was no type of consequences or anything. They just went straight through it. They did not care. But when there were those consequences and routines and procedures in place, they were much likely to perform better. I like this source that I use simply from the fact that it just reinstates what the teacher in the interview process told me, that the importance of building relationships and maintaining those relationships in the classroom is just important as making sure that the consequences are prevalent. Now, going into the findings and implications. So first part was the differentiation. So according to the study, the absence of the necessary student consequences created a negative impact on the students. It has caused them to have less motivation and drive to complete their work. So this was in means of all types of consequences completely gone from the classroom. It had a very negative impact. However, this research goes on to say when there were those consequences placed, just like I stated before, it ran smoothly. There was procedure, there was expectations for the students, and there was no right or wrong. The students did not question the way that the teacher ran her classroom or anything like that, mainly because they knew what was expected of them. This also spoke to the necessary means for communication with the students when they were communicated, what was going on, why they were receiving that consequences, or why they were not receiving any consequences. That helped them to understand what the teacher was doing and why she was making the choices that she was. The next finding had to deal with experience. So, of course, after consulting with the participants for my interview process, it was evident that the main reasoning behind their ability to decipher when that differentiation was necessary originates from their underlying experience in education. Um, of course, like I said before, I didn't share anything about either of what the teachers said to each other. However, it was concluded that the only reason that they would be able to know the consequences they should be given is because they had both been a part of the education system for the last 30 years or so. So, as a first year teacher going into this, I think it alleviates a little bit of stress on my end from the fact that, I can't be expected to have the same type of experience or the same type of understanding as a veteran teacher who's been there for 30 years. However, I did have now the understanding that in order to reach that as quickly as I can, I need to do research on my own. However, going into my first year teaching, I am understanding what is needing to be done of me in order to understand that and what I have to do in order to be able to communicate with the students. As far as consequential differentiation goes, according to the findings that I had here, it does not have any type of negative impact on the students as long as they are communicated to in that manner. It is not okay to just, give out consequences left and right and not explain to the students what's expected of them or explain the reason as to why they're getting in trouble. So it's always important to keep them in the know. It also builds that trust back and forth that they know what you expect of them, and if they are not reaching that expectation, that you have complete responsibility for that and that you will receive a consequence for it. And lastly, the impact on the students. So here's just a little excerpt that I use in one of my findings. It says, when asked why, the students explained that he trusted the teacher and knew that she wouldn't do anything unfair or in favor of anybody else. This was according to Allen, 1986. I concluded from this research that the most important thing that a teacher can do in order to preserve the positivity within the classroom is to ensure that all students feel that they have a positive existing relationship with the teacher. So overall, I found that this, and mainly why I included it last, was because this was the main finding through all of that. Is it okay to differentiate behavior? Yes, if you have an established relationship. Is it okay, to build that relationship with the students and get to know them in order to know what consequences work for them? Yes. What kind of impact does it have on the students when some students are given a specific consequence while others maybe receive a much harsher consequence? The only impact is going to be a positive impact if you have that established relationship with the student. So I take this finding going into my first year teaching as incredibly helpful, and I hope that future teachers or whoever's watching this presentation can relate as well, that in order to differentiate consequences or to have a successful classroom management system, you have to build that relationship with a student. One thing that my teacher did say, whom I interviewed, that if you need to spend that entire first week or week and a half just getting to know your students, that is what she recommends after 30 years in the career. So some teachers, they think as soon as school starts, right away they have to hit the books for that testing scores and all the good stuff. And of course, that is our responsibility. It is our job. However, we need to make sure that we need to build those relationships in that first week, mainly because those relationships are going to spread with us throughout our entire year with the students. So if that means that we're behind a week on our education and on our academics, then the teachers that I spoke to said so be it. As long as you have that existing relationship with the student, everything will eventually fall into place, and it will help to create a positive learning environment. This was my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.